The following podcast was recorded in December of 2023, and it took me a while to figure out what to do with it, because the issue of freedom of speech is at the foundation of everything I do as a scientist, writer, educator. A few days after recording this podcast, YouTube demonetized my channel and took down one of my most popular videos, a video of me reading the Unabomber Manifesto. I originally did this video as part of a podcast series that explored why Ted Kaczynski gained popularity in the memosphere, and we examined his ideas in depth. In the podcast, writings, and the caption of the video that was taken down, I was clear that this was for educational purposes, but YouTube took the video down, citing dangerous extremism. The crazy thing is that I was demonetized 2 days after being accepted into the YouTube partnership program, and the video had been up over a year. The original video I wrote as a companion for this podcast was a satirical account drawing a parallel between me making a video about free speech after YouTube took down my video and John Milton's path to publishing Areopagitica, a pamphlet arguing for freedom of the press and the right to publish without a license, after he was denied the right to publish the pamphlet. But I realized my satire would be lost on most people because A, they don't know the story of John Milton, and B, they don't see YouTube as censoring because censorship refers specifically to the use of state power to control freedom of expression. So before I give you the podcast I recorded with Jacob Mchangama, Vanderbilt research professor and founder of the Future of Free Speech, I want to explain a few things. First of all, that the lines between large corporations and the state are blurred, and second, that free speech is still a critical issue for societal progress because some people have more access to free speech than others. First, you have to understand that YouTube, now owned by Google, helped to write the laws on how platforms can moderate content. In 1996, tech platforms advised freshman Senator Ron Wyden and Representative Chris Cox on the draft of the Communications Decency Act and its famous Section 230, which states, "No provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider." Section 230 provides impunity to online platforms who allow users to publish whatever they want. It basically allows the platform to take down whatever they see fit and leave up whatever they see fit. In 1996, maybe Wyden didn't realize that all news and information would go digital from that point forward, giving these companies a total monopoly over all the information available in the world. But here we are. This is part of the reason why the discussion around free speech has been reignited. The second reason is because in 2010, a monumental Supreme Court case known as Citizens United versus the FEC completely reshaped the landscape of political campaign financing in the United States. In a 5-4 decision, the court ruled that the government could not restrict money spent on political contributions by corporations and unions, citing the First Amendment's protection of free speech. This ruling opened the floodgates for unlimited spending by outside groups in elections, leading to a significant increase in the influence of money in politics. TLDR, you can buy a politician. Supporters of the ruling argue that it protects free speech by allowing more voices to be heard in the political arena. But the critics contend that it disproportionately empowers wealthy individuals and organizations, drowning out the voices of everyday citizens. So we have to ask ourselves, what does free speech truly mean in a world where money can amplify some voices and silence others? And how do we ensure that the democratic process remains accessible to all, rather than being dominated by a select, rich few? We must confront the unsettling reality that corporations, like governments, wield significant power over the dissemination of information and the contours of free speech. Just as John Milton advocated for freedom of the press in Areopagitica, we find ourselves in a modern struggle where the voices of a few giants shape the public discourse and determine what is acceptable. This merging of corporate and state power raises profound questions about the nature of free speech in our digital age. It's critical for all of us to ponder how we can reclaim the principles of free speech in a world increasingly dominated by corporate interests. What responsibilities should tech companies have in moderating content and the public square? And how does this affect our right to free speech and press when citizens are journalists now publishing information on Substack, YouTube, and Twitter? How should minority voices be represented in the public sphere, especially when some individuals and organizations have vastly greater resources? What role do educational institutions play and scholars fostering dialogue about free speech when you can get education everywhere on the internet now? As you listen to the following podcast, I invite you to reflect on these questions and consider the implications of our current state of free expression. The future of free speech depends on our collective ability to understand and challenge the structures that shape it, ensuring that all voices have the opportunity to be heard. Yeah, that was real formal. I did script it. But this is important. Welcome to Neo Academia. I'm your host, Natasha Mott, and today I'm joined by Jacob Mchangama, Vanderbilt research professor and founder of the Future of Free Speech Project. Jacob is the author of a brilliant book, Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media, which explores the evolution of free speech across time and its crucial role in society. In this episode, we reflect on the significance of free speech as a cornerstone of progress and societal growth, diving into the complexities of content moderation in the digital age, where algorithms and AI play a growing role in deciding what gets silenced and what remains audible. How do we ensure that these technologies, often controlled by corporate giants, don't infringe upon the basic right to free expression? In this conversation is about more than just defending free speech. It's about understanding its role in innovation, democracy, and maintaining a healthy public dialogue into the future. This episode is possible thanks to Theory Gang Substack subscribers and, of course, our sponsor, Big Nerve. I've been working with Big Nerve for a while now to develop a community of innovative, creative thinkers, and their goal is simple. They want to recognize and fund creative thinkers. They're trying to create an entire new profession of innovation where catalysts like me could ask interesting and engaging questions, and innovators like you can answer them. There are many different ways to play. You can ask questions, answer them, rate answers, mentor answers. All of this earns you points. At the end of the month, these idea tournaments pay out to the top 30 participants, and everybody gains some more experience points and gets known for their expertise. This game is meant to elevate creative thinkers and their ideas. To join my team, you'll have to click on the Big Nerve question in the Theory Gang newsletter, where each episode I'll design a special question relevant to the guest and discussion. All right, here's the episode. Now don't forget to listen all the way to the end for the question. John Wilson told me about you, and he sent me an email randomly and was like, "You need to have him on your podcast. He's awesome. He's at Vanderbilt." And I thought about it for a second. I was like, am I a free speech girly? Is this where I'm going? Is this what I'm doing? And then I thought, no, everybody should be a free speech girly or boy or whatever. Because I think people just completely forget that this is a thing that we have to be responsible for in the world. So how can people take this up on their own without being like a legal scholar or somebody who's academically interested in this?
Well, as someone who's written a book on the history of free speech, I think that's a very good starting point. Take a look at the values that you hold most dear, and then go into an imaginary time machine and go back 100 years or 200 years and examine the viewpoints that you hold today, the values that you think are the most important. What would the consequences be of promoting them 100 or 200 years ago? If you believe in LGBT rights and you were to advance those 100 or 200 years ago, you might find yourself in prison or beaten up with impunity. You certainly would not have a prominent platform. If you were fighting for racial justice, you could very well be on the receiving end of a prison sentence or a violent mob that potentially wanted to lynch you. Or if you were, say, opposed to American involvement in foreign wars, go back 100 years ago, and you would easily find yourself getting a prison sentence of 10 years or so. So that's a good starting point. So many of almost all of the ideas that a lot of people today in open democracies take for granted were viewpoints that at some point were criminalized, seen as dangerous, not because the powers in be at the time were evil, but just because they saw those ideas and the people that advanced them as being dangerous to the social cohesion of society and believed firmly that those kinds of ideas need to be suppressed.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting that you've touched on more left-leaning ideas because it almost seems intentional that they've tried to make free speech like a right-leaning issue, that the right should be concerned about free speech or the left has no need to be concerned about free speech. Like it's a foregone conclusion already. We already have free speech. What are we worrying about protecting those who have bad ideas for?
Yeah, definitely. I would say free speech is always under attack from all sides just because human beings have a very difficult time going from the abstract commitment to free speech that a lot of us in open democracies, actually across the world, will profess a belief in. But then once it becomes tangible and concrete, and you have to actually defend ideas that you abhor, then free speech suddenly becomes very difficult for the human brain to uphold. We have a very difficult time navigating sort of the possibility that defending the right to profess certain ideas is not the same as being in favor of it. You can actually defend the right for someone to profess an idea that you dislike and at the same time speak out against it. But that's difficult. So it's not just a left right thing, but I think especially in the US in the past decade or so, the progressive liberal left used to be maybe the heartland of free expression, has increasingly seen free speech as a tool for the powerful against the powerless, as entrenching unequal power relations, and therefore as something that needs to be rethought or recalibrated. I think that's a profoundly misguided and dangerous idea, but it's certainly something that you have to grapple with. At the same time, I think there's also a lot of free speech opportunism on the right. So I think people on the right are right to complain about cancel culture, even though you also see cancel culture attempts to cancel from the right. But it's certainly true that there's been a lot of cancel culture coming from the left. But you definitely also see people on the right who are perfectly happy to use repression and censorship, including using state power. So to fight back against wokeism, for instance, as we see in Florida and lots of other Republican dominated states.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how it gets kind of manipulated, and once you have it, you almost are like, "Oh, I don't need to worry about this thing anymore. It's not going anywhere." And the truth is it really could go somewhere. And I think that's what the future of free speech is all about, right? It's like, where could this go? And I love your book because I've talked to a lot of scholars on this podcast, and there is a feels like a barrier to access a lot of information. You really address a lot of these historical circumstances with finesse in a way that I think anybody could understand and anybody could read if they're interested, if they like history. But to that effect, where do you think we are in that historical continuum? There's so many instances where free speech has been at attention. I have my own thought about where we are, but would you say this is accurate? To describe it as a loop where we kind of circle back through similar trends, but we're always kind of moving forward. It's not a complete circle back, but each time we revolve around this.
Yeah, it's certainly true that a lot of the arguments that we're having today that people think are completely novel, you could go back to the invention of the printing press and you would have some of the same arguments, even though the technology is different now. It's about social media, generative AI, and you have this tendency of elite panic where the institutional gatekeepers always tend to fret about the consequences of expanding the public sphere, allowing people who previously did not have a voice in the public sphere access to speak and get information that was controlled by some special group beforehand. At one point, that could have been the Catholic Church. In more modern times, it would have been legacy media and small groups of public intellectuals, politicians who had a de facto privileged status to the public sphere. Of course, it's not that history repeats itself, but there are certainly very clear echoes of controversies of the past that I think that we can learn from. And I think there are two ways you could look at where we are right now. You could take a very positive look and you could say, look, as I mentioned, 100 years ago, if you opposed American participation in World War I, you'd go to prison for 10 years. And also just the practical exercise of free speech today gives opportunities to ordinary people that were not available to anyone, even the most prominent author not that long ago, because we could just access information and ideas at scale. And we can also disseminate our own due to technology. You and I can have a conversation in real time with no censorship, even though we're We're not that far physically apart, but in principle, you could be in Japan and I could be in the US, and no one could stop this conversation.
I don't necessarily see free speech as explicitly being opposed in most instances. But when you talk about this elite gatekeeping, it's regarded as scholarly. When user 54326 on the internet talks about it, it's conspiratorial. What is it that's so important about official free speech? Like right now in the US, we have it. We can do this. In most places, we can hear from people in Japan or wherever across the globe. So, what's the importance here and now? And why do we need to do anything about it at all?
Yeah, so I think free speech has been a driver of what has been called the third wave of democratization. So from the 70s until the early 2000s, there was a huge expansion of democracy around the globe in Latin America, in sub-Saharan Africa, and so on. And free speech was absolutely crucial to those developments. And of course, if you go back in time, the American Revolution would be very difficult to imagine the American Revolution without the writings, the pamphlets, the protests. Every marginalized group that has fought for equality has relied on these things. And if you want to go to science, it would be very difficult to imagine science progressing if it wasn't an inherent part of science to question the results and findings of others, for which you need scientific freedom, a part of free speech. There are lots of goods that come out of free speech. But today, we just presented a report where we've looked at the developments in 22 open democracies around the globe.
Mhm.
And so we asked experts in those countries to identify what are the trends since 2015. And we find that in these 22 open democracies, 78% of the developments identified by national experts were speech restrictive. So this means that we're living through what I would call a free speech recession,
Mm.
which is not only afflicting the authoritarian states of the world where you would expect censorship and repression, but also the open democracies. And I think this is likely to have very serious long-term consequences for the health of democracy and also for underlying values like tolerance, like individual freedom, trust. And that's why I think it's absolutely crucial to stand up for free speech. And you have to do it in a principled manner because you could always, especially with social media, you can always pick out examples where free speech becomes ugly or maybe even leads to harms, real harms, and costs. And so it's easy to be guided by those examples and say, well, we need to do something about it. But but it's very rare for decision makers to take a more holistic view and say, actually, millions of people around the world every day are gaining enormous benefits for free speech that we don't talk about, that we don't discuss because they're not as visible and they're not as spectacular as the harms that you can
Mhm.
identify.
Yeah, there's a real negativity bias.
Yeah.
So I think one of the most blatant examples of free speech being called into question we're seeing today is happening in universities, but specifically with what's going on right now with anti-Semitism and the question of what is hate speech, what is acceptable, what goes against university policy. I think a lot of people have seen the clip now of university administrators using legal jargon to be like, no, calling for the genocide of Jews is not hate speech. Calling for the global intifada, is that hate speech? Is that under freedom of speech? Like, what is that? Is that allowed or no?
And that's a good question because the term hate speech is obviously subjective. And this is one of the problems with this term when it becomes codified into laws, as is the case in almost all open democracies, apart from the United States, where hate speech needs to rise to a very high threshold before the government is allowed to restrict it.
Mhm.
And I think really Israel Palestine is the perfect example of why hate speech laws don't work because you could never, ever get partisans of that conflict to agree on what constitutes hate speech and what is legitimate expression. So if a Palestinian was to chant Palestine from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free. If you're a pro Israeli, you might interpret that as being a call to genocide because that would entail the destruction of Israel and thereby all the Jews that live there. But to a pro Palestinian, it might signify merely Palestinian liberation or the establishment of a Palestinian state.
This is why it's good the lawyers are involved, because you guys never give a straight answer. A straight answer is no, that is not illegal to say, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
that's why we
Under,
need you.
and I think in most European countries, chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free, would not be seen as hate speech. But then in a lot of European states, something called glorification of terrorism is also criminalized. So if you were to, for instance, in Denmark, where I'm from, there have been Muslim groups who have been demonstrating, and this rhymes in Danish, doesn't rhyme in English, but they're chanting, Palestine is occupied, the solution is jihad. And that could potentially be seen as glorification of terrorism. It would not be punishable in the US, but it's something that could be punishable in certain European states. And I think
Really?
one of the reasons why these university presidents got into a lot of trouble is that these institutions have been increasingly intolerant of vastly expanded definitions of harm or hate speech, where they crack down on even the use of slurs in as part of teaching. If you want to teach free speech, you might want to be able to use the N word, for instance. But there are certainly instances where professors get in trouble, sanctioned for doing that, even though I think it's important to say this is where the lines are being drawn. And then suddenly you have Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th, and you have students who not only justify the attack, but who go out of the way for praising it, who might actually say, we support Hamas. We see ourselves as part of the movement of Hamas in ways that if you'd said that about other groups previously, that would have entailed consequences, or they would have condemned it in terms. And now suddenly they take a very different line. And in many ways, if you're a private university, you're not bound by the First Amendment. But if you have a speech policy in place that says our speech policies adhere to the First Amendment, then they're right in saying that it depends on context, because it's probably misleading to say that many of these students explicitly called for the genocide of Jews. That's an interpretation of it. So they're actually right in saying it depends on context. What was the exact wording? Was this up in the face of Jewish students as part of intimidation or harassment or threats, in which case it might violate policies?
Yeah.
But the way that they framed it, from how they framed issues over racial justice or LGBT rights and so on, it's just very different and just shows a blatant double standards, which I think for a lot of people is difficult to accept.
What might be exemplary is if you had a KKK march next to the pro-Palestine march. That might be a stunt that would exemplify.
If someone after the killing of George Floyd had organized a white supremacist rally on the campus of Penn State or Harvard, I think it's impossible to imagine that the response from the university would not have been very different. And this is one of the problems with the universities, is that increasingly they have, from an official standpoint, not only have they cracked down on types of speech that are First Amendment protected and thereby undermined their official commitment to free speech, but they've also taken political positions on all kinds of issues. And once you start doing that as a university, then it becomes very difficult going forward, because then all kinds of groups expect you to have an official position on this or that topic.
Yeah.
And so if you've called out after the George Floyd thing, if you've made a very robust position on racial justice, then obviously some people are going to say, well, why can't you come out and condemn a terrorist attack in which women were raped and innocents were killed while the perpetrators filmed it and were making jubil and were whooping and high-fiving?
You become the meme, the I support the current thing meme.
Yeah. And that's why I think a policy of, you can call it principled neutrality or whatever you want to call it, is
Yeah.
the right one for universities. The university can certainly condemn hatred but taking a position on Israel, Palestine, or abortion rights or things like that is invites problems down the road. And I think it also just I think it really erodes trust in higher education, and universities have already suffered a lot of
Yeah.
trust erosion just because when you see those statements, it just to the ordinary viewer, these university presidents just seem completely without any sort of standards or principles and
Mm.
just willing to go with whatever seems the most convenient at a specific time.
Yeah. Well, I think since the 70s, we've seen this kind of monoculture of universities where everything is the same. You can kind of go everywhere and get the same education. Of course, going to Ivy League, you get the notoriety, the alleged connections, but arguably the data show you would have already had those connections if you can afford to go to those places. So, what I see happening in the future of higher education is we really do have like brand specific institutions. Like my daughter keeps saying she wants to go to Harvard Law and she doesn't like to read. So we have another problem. But I keep saying, well, you should consider Vanderbilt. It's like the Harvard of the South. And I think, and I really do believe that these institutions are going to kind of ebb and flow into a new Ivy League, or maybe not even an Ivy League. It's going to be like the Silicon League or something else that's going to happen, especially with AI. There's going to be fragmentation of what you go to college to achieve. Is it status? Because it damn sure ain't learning. That's really not what we could do that anywhere. It's formal credentialism, it's status, it's scholarship. So, what are your thoughts about that? Obviously, you're at Vanderbilt, so you must agree in some way.
First of all, maybe your daughter won't have to read just because maybe with AI you can just have some future chatbot from OpenAI inserted in her brain. It'll access all human available knowledge. No, but more seriously, I'm not an expert on this, but I think it would be good if there was a development where there's more sort of competition rather than universities all becoming more and more the same as where specific values, political values dominate. Some universities stand out, try different models, compete. And of course, old school enough to say that it would be great if that resulted in the universities winning out. That sort of return to what I see as the core of universities is providing students with knowledge.
It's basic
Uh,
stuff.
yeah, rather than of prestige or social activism. It's not that there's anything necessarily wrong with social activism. You can do that outside the universities. You've never had better opportunities through social media to do social activism, but you'd hope that the universities choose something different from that. And maybe the social activism of the students can be better informed once if they went to universities that are rigorously committed to the highest possible levels of education, and also providing an education that does not coddle the students, that actually challenges them and doesn't say, oh well, our students tend not to like these kinds of ideas and therefore we have to be subservient to whatever values are prevalent among them.
I think that's going to be a very specific kind of university moving forward because something occurred to me as to why they've become these advocacy machines rather than just machines of social mobility, which is what they were for the past 20 years. I think the opportunity to glom onto structures of power is what's really sought after right now because corporations have developed into these mega powerful overlords. And I think what people are looking for is a champion to be their megazord for their advocacy. And it seems like universities are relatively neutral or they're in the service of knowledge. Whereas I think corporations, I think I've said this before, they seem to like wear the skin of advocacy. They like put on a mask of the current, supporting the current thing, but it's all to propel their own interest, which is self propagation and survival. Whereas universities' core interest is relaying knowledge, they can't compete with that industry motive, but they're still very powerful because industry has kind of used them. Now that industry won't really need universities, they have to show value to the corporations, I think, in different ways. That's at least what I see. So advocacy from the university will be, I think, a specific type of university moving forward. Like, oh, I went to this advocacy centric place. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that in those terms. I think one potential reason, I think probably also has something to do with donations. So who
Hmm.
donates to universities, and also if the students who pay tuition and they are charged a lot of of money, then do you might feel that you have an incentive to cater to them rather than challenging them because you're afraid that otherwise they're going to spend their dollars in another place. So I think that may be part of the problem. I certainly have not been down that rabbit hole that you described, which I'd love to read more about what you've read about, what you've written about that. But I think it's interesting now. It seems that a lot of universities are at least signaling, and this includes Vanderbilt, that they want to get back to basics. And that includes a rigorous commitment to academic freedom. I think many of them have probably realized that the pendulum has swung too far in the direction of advocacy and social justice. And while that was maybe useful in the short term, then it has real long term consequences that are not aligned with the core purpose of a university and that could be self destructive in the long run. I hope that this is a reversal of course that we'll see at many universities. But I think it's difficult for universities because one thing is professing commitment to academic freedom, another thing is resisting the pressure to engage in advocacy and social justice and spitting out talking points that conform to whatever the loudest advocacy movement is demanding on a specific issue. And
Do
that
you
that requires real leadership. It requires spine, and I'm not sure that all universities have that combination.
Well, I think that's what the power of institutions is. And you mentioned Karl Popper in your book. I may not agree with Popper entirely, but I think he had some values that I think work. And one of his values was that's why institutions are so powerful because the people who run these institutions come and go, but the structure stands. Like, so thinking about Vanderbilt, for example, they brought you on. The Future of Free Speech Institute is now at Vanderbilt. And the power of tenure, in a sense, is such that it ain't going nowhere. Like they can't get rid of you unless you leave, in a sense, you take your business elsewhere, quite literally. So just by having that institutional structure of tenure, of that stickiness and those principles, they've brought something to Vanderbilt that no matter what happens with the next 10 university presidents, you will have been there with your institution and left your mark. And people will take note of that. Oh, they must support this
Mm.
institute if they can't get rid of it or they won't get rid of it. My question is, has Vanderbilt so far shown you any of that kind of trembling or hesitancy in the face of that pressure? And if so, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, I should say I don't have tenure. I have a fancy title as research professor,
So
but
nothing.
yeah,
You're not going to do anything yet.
but we have, and we're an independent entity. We're a 501c3 organization, but we have a very good relationship with Vanderbilt. I think the Chancellor, Daniel Diemeyer here, is very sincere in promoting free speech, academic freedom, and Vanderbilt has been very supportive. There's never been an instant where the university has come and said, well, maybe you shouldn't say this or do this. And we take up, you know, positions that where we frequently criticize hate speech, frequently criticize governments, both state governments, the federal government, democratic governments around the world, and there's been absolutely no pushback. So that's been great. And also, I think that Vanderbilt is a little different from, say, Harvard or Penn State in that the students here, from what I can, first of all, it's a university in the South. And I think that means that even though I think the majority of students tend to lean liberal, it's not as it's not as it isn't as skewed politically as it might be at Harvard. I think if you're a very liberal student from the Northeast or the West Coast and you decide to go to Vanderbilt in the South, that probably also means that you have accepted the idea that you're going to live in a state where a lot of people are going to have very different opinions from you on a lot of issues that matter to you. So there's maybe some self-selecting there on the part of the student
Mm.
body that the people who come here are already people who are open-minded, as compared to if you go to very liberal colleges or universities as a very liberal person. So I think there's more heterodox atmosphere here among the students, and there also just seems to be less of the social justice advocacy and a lot of focus on academic excellence on part of the students here, from my experience.
So it's harder to piss them off, is what you're saying.
Yeah, or it's not that they don't care. I think they do, but so far my own experiences has been one where they are very open to having these kinds of discussions on various topics. We haven't faced any pushback from students, even if we might have taken positions that some disagree with. It might happen. Who knows? But
If
so
you
far,
push hard enough, it will.
yeah,
I think, and that's the question is like, what are the limits of it? Because if Vanderbilt wants to be the leader in free speech, I think you have to look towards the limits of free speech, really riding the edge of that. And I think one of the things you mentioned at it was the dialogue seminar where I went, where you and Jod were talking about social media and free speech. And one of the things you mentioned was that there's a requisite decorum. And I think this is something that young people, maybe a little bit more like anti establishment people, are pushing up against because the ground rules are changing. What do you think are some like absolute requirements? Like, we can't change these rules of decorum.
I would say aggressive, disruptive heckling at lectures or classes is a good example, right? So, in general, free speech would allow you to stand on the corner of Lower Broadway in Nashville with your sign and shout on the top of your lungs all kinds of things. But you can't allow that in a classroom or at a lecture at a university, because that would disrupt the core function of the university. And that doesn't have anything to do with the specific viewpoint offered. It just has something to do with disrupting the speech of the speakers. And a very important corollary of the right to free speech is the right to access information, the right to listen, as Frederick Douglass famously said when he was heckled by sort of white Bostonians when he was giving an anti-slavery speech at a meeting in Boston in 1860. So I think that's really a core difference between general free speech and academic freedom as a subset of the larger freedom to speak. And it would be impossible if you say to the students, well, yeah, if you're not happy with whatever is being taught, you can just stand up in the classroom and heckle whoever you want to. That would lead to completely dysfunctional universities.
Well, what about on social media? You and I have talked about this a little
Yeah.
bit in the past about where there's some things I'll do. And I think almost we're going through this very adolescent phase, I feel like, with social media where we're acting out. And I act out as well. I will say some very teenage and childish stuff on the internet, like science is authoritarian was one of my favorite hooks. You know, I'm very pro science. It pisses people off and it gets their attention. What do you think about the misinformation? Because a lot of platforms are saying this is disruptive or this is against our code of conduct, much like it would be to stand up in the middle of a lecture hall and be like,
Yeah.
you suck.
Yeah, I don't think that misinformation is disruptive in the say. I don't think that's a good analogy to the student standing up and disrupting a speaker in the lecture hall, because there's so much information on social media. That's the whole point. And if I choose to write something that is misinformation, I don't see that as being disruptive. It might potentially lead to harms. If I was to peddle the conspiracy theory that drinking bleach would cure COVID, then you could potentially imagine a situation where that could lead to someone being stupid enough to believe me and drinking bleach, and that could have consequences for that person. But I think in general, the discussions about social media, that's where we probably see the strongest parallels to previous outbreaks of elite panic. This idea that now suddenly everyone can have a voice, including people who would never get anywhere near the public sphere as it was previously curated and edited by quote unquote responsible journalists, editors, and so on. And that, of course, gives an opportunity for people to spread lies and conspiracy theories, to say hateful things that would not be published in the New York Times previously. But it's also gives a lot of different perspectives that you wouldn't hear otherwise. And I think we have this sort of rose tinted view of the past. I hear this all the time. Oh, before social media, you could rely on what was being spread in.
The Walter Cronkite argument.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. I really wish someone would do this experiment where they go back and look at news stories in mainstream newspapers and TV channels, and then look at the accuracy of it. Take a good example. Walter Duranty was the New York Times correspondent in the Soviet Union in the 30s, and he basically won the Pulitzer Prize for spreading Stalinist propaganda about how the policies of forced collectivization in Ukraine was not really that bad, when in fact millions of people were starved to death or sort of hauled off to gulags. And I don't think that story could have gone unchallenged today, because today there would have been people with smartphones filming what was
Right.
going on. People would, even under Stalinism, even though Stalin surely would have used social media to do propaganda and disinformation that would make Putin look like an amateur, there would still have been videos and images, content coming out of that showed that Walter Duranty was basically just regurgitating Stalinist propaganda. And I think probably you could find lots of stories that were not accurate or miss important perspectives. But I think from a psychological point of view, it's probably nice for human beings to say, well, we have some institutions, media institutions for knowledge productions. These are trustworthy. And
Mm,
so their account is the truth, or as close as we come to it. That's psychologically comforting,
yeah.
because it's not psychologically comforting to navigate the social media environment of apparent chaos and anarchy, which demands a lot of people. How do you determine whether a narrative coming out of Gaza, whether that is propaganda or whether it's the truth? It would have been easier just to rely 20 years ago on what the New York Times or the Washington Post wrote about it. But it turns out that some of the reporting about this attack on a hospital, for instance, all the sort of legacy media reports that came out about it turned out to be inaccurate. It seems that now, initially the story was that it was an Israeli attack, and now it seems, as most experts agree, that it's more likely that it was a Palestinian rocket or explosive device that
Hmm.
that caused this explosion. If we had just relied on legacy media, it might have been psychologically comforting. This is what happened. We know this because a trusted source said it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's true.
Yeah. And the problem is that some of our trusted sources should not be trusted. We know this now. But I really like what you said. Lysenko, as would not have been pervasive today, because someone would have taken a picture of all the crops and been like, "Oh, is this the science you're talking about?" So back then, these laws and rules and hard standards and institutions on misinformation would have been brilliant. But today, they seem superfluous at best, dangerous at most, because with the citizen journalism and kind of the collective intelligence of the internet and social media, all of those ideas flying around kind of make up not just the chaos, but actually the opinion of the people. I really think Max is the guy for this, because he presented something at your symposium, which was looking at whether ChatGPT can lie or not. And I think the harnessing of collective intelligence is really going to be useful for gathering misinformation and understanding what is misinformation, because you'll be able to see how many people are tweeting it was Hamas and how many people are tweeting it was Israeli. And you'll be able to trace back, okay, this is an Israeli soldier. This is someone who controls the missiles. And this is like, you'll be able to kind of almost unwind the truth from the collective. And that, of course, then will become the institution.
Yeah, and I also really believe that the only way forward is to update our institutions of knowledge production. Again, there's a parallel to the if when the printing press came out, it took a long time before any sort of reliable professional standards of journalism developed. A lot of the things that were initially printed, go back and look at Martin Luther's writings against the Catholic Church. He'd use memes of the Pope and cardinals as devils, and he'd write very inflammatory stuff. So I think the it's hopeless and dangerous and can lead to authoritarianism. This understandable psychological urge to try and impose some kind of top-down control of a public sphere, which seems to be where institutional gatekeepers seem to experience a control loss that seems to unleash all kinds of dangerous developments. But I think it's ultimately impossible to impose that top-down control, certainly in democracies. China can get away with it, but it has also developed the most dystopian system of information control and censorship in the history of our species. And I don't think we want to go down that way. And I think lots of people are working on it. You mentioned Max Tegmark, who was at our symposium on AI and free speech at Vanderbilt in October. He's got this Improve the News website that I think he developed with some students at MIT, which is an attempt to look at information, news stories, and how they're reported in liberal versus conservative media, and then take out what both sides agree on, and then sort of isolate the spin on each side. So that empowers readers to make up their minds on an informed background. I think there are all these kinds of ways to try and make more robust, trustworthy ways of disseminating information and ideas that we just have not developed yet, because the technological development has been so rapid. And we're still navigating the digital age according to mental modes of the analog age and according to institutions and ways of thinking that were developed for a very different age. And I think it's going to take a long time before we've patched and updated our capacity to navigate this age. And of course, we've been discussing social media and content moderation on there for a decade, and then suddenly, OpenAI just explodes everything with generative AI, and then suddenly social media seems like the Walkman, and we're talking about that compared to the possibilities and dangers of AI. But I still ultimately think that a bottom-up approach that harnesses the creative potential of human beings is a very important part of the solution to the very real issues that we're faced. And I think going back to the mirage of top-down control of the public sphere is doomed and dangerous.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. There are things that are already being top-down controlled that we don't want controlled. And I don't know if I've talked about this with you, but I talk about it with anybody. Citizens United. I don't know why I never hear people talk about this, but this is something that is being top-down controlled, in my opinion, that needs to be thought about at least. So the idea for those first-time listeners of my podcast, the idea that money and monetary contributions to political campaigns should be protected under the First Amendment, to me, is a wild idea. But we're also living into the age of compute, where something like computing power will also be protected under the First Amendment if there's a precedent for money to be there. So what are your thoughts about this? Should this be protected under the First Amendment? And if so, why?
Yeah. So first of all, I should say I'm not a First Amendment scholar or expert. I'm not a U.S. trained lawyer. So I think should corporations enjoy free speech? I think they should. The New York Times is a corporation. So it would be, if you were to have a rule saying that corporations did not enjoy free speech rights, a lot of for-profit media organizations, for instance, would not enjoy it. I would not have a problem though with if you set up rules saying that are viewpoint neutral, saying you can only spend X amount as a corporation to support a particular political candidate. That's your free speech rights. But we impose limits on how much you can spend in an election circle or on a specific candidate. I wouldn't see that as a problem from a free speech point of view. Um,
Why do you think this is not in the public sphere of discussion? The idea that you can pretty much buy candidates and the fact that we spend so much money on elections in the United States seems to present a bit of a problem, but yet we never hear about it.
well, I would say that the Citizens United case, from what I've seen, is certainly one that has divided opinion quite a bit. But just as someone who's not an American, it certainly seems wild the amount of money put into politics, like political campaigns, even not only sort of presidential campaigns, but
I couldn't run for city council.
yeah, and that doesn't seem healthy for a democracy. And also, just this is not necessarily something to do with free speech, but just the fact that that you only have two big political parties also just seems to be not very satisfying, because a lot of people have complex sets of political opinions that don't map perfectly with one of each party. However, I think it's really interesting when you talk about American politics, you typically talk about the federal level, right? Congress and so on. But at the local level, how vibrant democracy can also be there is also inspiring, and how people can vote for one party at a federal level and then doesn't necessarily mean that they endorse all the political views of that party, because they might vote very differently locally. But I definitely think that the two-party system and the influence of money is something that seems not to be great for democracy.
Yeah, it's a little bit outsized, I would say. I'm always surprised that this doesn't get more attention. But then again, if you think about it, if who would want this to stay in place? Who would want the two-party system? It's like going to the casino and betting all on black versus spreading your chips out on the roulette table. Like, it's much more effective to have only two places to put your chips.
Yeah,
Um,
and obviously, if you're one of the two parties, then you don't have a great incentive to open it up to others. But then again, I'm from Denmark, and we have a coalition government which is made up of the traditional big center right party, the Social Democrats, and then this new sort of centrist party. And I think that also just means that these political parties have to sell out a lot of their values and compromise. So yesterday, a law was passed which criminalizes the improper treatment of texts of significance to a religious community. So it's basically a criminalization of the burning of Qurans that has
Whoa.
been going on in Denmark for a while. And so a lot of these, back in 2017, all parties except the Social Democrats voted to repeal the Danish blasphemy ban, which hadn't led to conviction since 1946. But so in a political system like that, it also means that in order to find compromise, a lot of these political parties have to take up very cynical, or what seems to the public at least, very cynical positions, abandoning political platforms and so on, that I think is also likely to result in lack of trust to the political process. And so it just seems, in general, democracy right now does not seem to generate a lot of enthusiasm for the electoral process. And I think Martin Gurris and his book, The Revolt of the Public, is a very good explanation of what's going on in our digital age. And I think this is actually one where you could say that social media contributes to this lack of trust, because in previous times, politics would not be as dominant as it is now. Today, social media allows us to frame politics and politicians in a negative light all the time. Whereas there used to be a time where politicians could retire to a smoky back room and deals in secret and then come out and present something. That's just no longer the case. But again, that's why I think we need to be creative and really update both our set of institutions of knowledge production, our political institutions, our media institutions to the world and age that we live in with rapid technological development.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. If free speech doesn't become a lightning rod issue, we're going to lose it, I think. And it's not going to be just all of a sudden, it's the slow erosion of it. And
Yeah.
I think the biggest place where we're going to start to see that is with media conglomerates and corporations. There's a lot of talk about the Restrict Act and Section 230 and all of these kinds of pieces of legislation, which are talking about what we can say online, how we can say it, where we can say it. All of these are kind of like jabs at free speech, don't you think?
Well, it's really interesting. So lately, I've been reading a lot of contributions from American First Amendment scholars about Section 230, but also about the First Amendment. It seems like the general trend, at least amongst younger scholars, is this idea that you need to rethink free speech in America, and that American free speech exceptionalism has outplayed its role, and it's no longer fit for the world that we live in. We need to have more restrictions on free speech, on social media, and so on. But I actually disagree with that. I think that a lot of the suggestions, proposals for reform are likely to be a cure worse than the disease. And again, it's this magical thinking that if only you have some kind of democratic control with the public sphere, then you can sort out the good from the bad, which I think is extremely naive when it comes to social media, for instance, and now generative AI.
Mhm.
And also, especially in a country as diverse and polarized as the United States. Let's say you gave the federal government, broad powers to regulate misinformation or harmful information on social media. Then you imagine that, yeah, Trump wins the next election. Do you think he's going to use those powers in the same way that the Biden administration is going to? You
No.
can already see it at the state levels, where if the First Amendment does not provide the same robust protection as it does now, I think you could be pretty sure that you'd have liberal states a lot of them would adopt these hate speech bans that in
Mhm.
order to protect minorities. And in conservative states, you would see even more attempts to crack down on cultural war issues that riles up conservatives. And so that's the real weaponization of free speech, is that if you remove it. So it's true that the American free speech exceptionalism does in the digital age does allow a lot of content that is ugly and polarizing. But I think the situation would be worse if you were to allow the federal and state governments much more control over what can be said. And I think you'd find out pretty quickly that that various groups, unpopular groups, would be on the receiving end, depending on who's in power.
Yeah, and you called it magical thinking. I would call it utopian thinking. This perception that, oh, if with the proper structure and the proper rules,
Yeah.
nothing bad will ever happen again. We can
Yeah.
prevent all of these horrible things from happening that would have happened in the past if only we had X, Y, and Z. And it's people really don't understand that it's whack-a-mole. It's just something else is going to spring up. And so I'm always shocked to hear the left, which I do not call the people I'm talking about liberal because this is not these are not liberal values. Um, I'm always shocked to hear them say, "Oh, well, we should just shut this down and shut this down." I'm like, "Whoa, that's not what we agreed to." And one thing I saw when prepping for this conversation, I was looking at like a free speech map of the world, but it showed Canada and obviously Scandinavia as being the free speech places, and we're like a little bit underneath that. But I was thinking about poor old Jordan Peterson and what he rose to fame for, which was his right to misgender people and thinking about how they have these laws in Canada. Should that not be a ding against free speech? And I think the perception is that is actually protecting people's free speech. How is restricting people's speech protecting them? Can you explain this logic to me?
Yeah, so I can understand sort of the logic to a certain extent. There are certainly studies that show that various groups will feel disinclined to participate in the public debate on social media, for instance, if they're subjected to hate speech and so on. And then the argument comes, well, in order for them not to self-censor, we need to ban others from participating because that will then give them the freedom to participate in the public debate. But I don't. So if someone was to say, well, okay, so we need to crack down on transphobic speech because a lot of trans people don't feel comfortable. But then would those people also accept if you were to say a lot of pro-choice people are attacking Christian conservatives who have pro-life views, and therefore Christian conservatives don't feel comfortable participating in public debates on social media? And my guess is that you would not find people who were in favor of banning both. So it always becomes about your perspective. Plus, when did historically marginalized groups have a better opportunity to speak out than today on social media? Do you have more people from minority backgrounds speaking out than before? Let's not forget, we're here today in Tennessee. If you were a prominent opponent of white supremacy laws that dominated this state that long ago, and you were to speak out prominently, you would face problems. So take someone like Ida B. Wells, this fierce advocate of equality both for African Americans and women, who set up a newspaper called the Memphis Free Speech
Mhm.
and who went around documented lynchings in the US. Incredibly brave woman, but her newspaper was burned down to the ground by a white mob after she said that these stories of Black men raping white women is an excuse for lynching Black men. And very often these relationships are actually consensual, something that really outraged white opinion. So I think even though it might be true that some members of minority groups feel disinclined to participate in public debate, you can't solve that by mandating that those who disagree with those opinions can't. Like that obviously has more negative free speech consequences, and it privileges specific viewpoints. It basically says, well, if you belong to a certain demographic as defined by whoever is in power at a given time, then not only do you have a privileged right to speak, but you also have a privileged right not to be subjected to ideas that you might feel uncomfortable with and that might make you more inclined not to participate. So I don't want to minimize the feeling of self-censorship that the tone on social media can sometimes have, but obviously, at least to me, imposing sort of government censorship in order to protect free speech is an Orwellian
Oh, it
thought.
is. And I wonder if these people have not really read sci-fi or any kind of dystopian novels. I often wonder this, or if they read them with the kind of glasses that only magnify what they see as bad, like reading The Handmaid's Tale. A lot of people who are fans of Atwood don't see the people in Tehran as handmaidens. They don't see the things colored in the way that they might actually be colored. But one thing I think about quite often is if Ida B. Wells had if her shop had not been burned down, would there have been as much impetus to support her and to push forward the next step? What is the meme? Like God saves his toughest battles for his strongest warriors. Why can't people just embrace how difficult it is to be an other? I mean, we used to be so punk rock in this country. Like you were other, and that was cool as fuck because you were other and you were going to rise up. And that was the point. It wasn't like, oh, we get buy in from Exxon to support our otherism. That's absurd. And it's not going to lead to the kind of outcomes that we find so profound.
Yeah, I don't know. Again, I think as someone who's committed to free speech, I probably, and maybe this is a strong argument against people like myself and who have a very principled approach to free speech, or at least try to. I probably have also been inconsistent at times, even though I really try not to. You're advancing this principle, which is just impossible for human beings to live up to. We're not principled human beings. We're much more likely to be swayed by our emotions than reason. And then you have a small group of people who live in with their heads in the clouds and demand that human beings should be guided by these very rational, abstract principles. So live in the real world where human beings can convince themselves, even if they profess faith in free speech, can absolutely convince themselves that censoring is actually needed in order to advance free speech, or why it's completely justified to say that group A should have a right to say something, but group B shouldn't. I think that's probably a, a, a strong argument against principled free speech. But then the corollary of accepting that is just to say, well, then it's just a free for all power grab game. Then it's just whoever is in
Yep.
power at any time gets to absolutely thwart the others, because none of us believe in principle.
The might is right.
If,
Yeah.
if I don't believe in principle, these other guys don't believe in principle. So if I don't suppress them when they're coming into power, they're going to do exactly the same to me. And that's why it's just justified to being led by my biases. I think that's not a very nice world. And also we have made incredible progress. So there was a time in European history, if you were a Catholic or a Protestant, you'd go to war with each other over what today seems like very abstract theological differences. Today, that tends not to be a problem. And so in many ways, I think free speech has made it possible to bridge gaps and let people live together in peace, who previously would have thought that their differences over philosophy or religion or politics were insurmountable and would require the extinction of, or at least the silencing of, those differing viewpoints.
Yeah. This is exactly the paradox of tolerance. And I think the thing that people forget about the paradox of tolerance is that it's paradoxical. Like, we can't solve it. And this is why I'm absurd to the core with like a dash of stoicism, because we have to love what happens, but that doesn't mean we're not going to keep trying to make the world that we think is appropriate, even if that world leads to some kind of chaos and destruction. We have to keep moving forward on our principles. And I think you're absolutely right. Like, if we don't do that, it's all heat death on either side. If we let everything go, it's all heat death. And if we pound everything down into regulations into the ground, it's heat death. So the struggle is to keep that beautiful tension, and it gets messy at times.
It
And I
gets
think
messy. And I think that's one of the things that we have to embrace and accept. And in a world where we have access to much more information than any other time in human history, that tension and the messiness is much more visible. But that's where we need to tap into our Buddhist/Stoic principles of not being led astray by our emotions, and also just saying that if someone insults me, I don't have to take it in. It's on then. I don't have to react to every single piece of content or commentary that triggers me. And by that, you can have a more detached attitude
yeah.
to the digital sphere. I think
Yeah.
that's a precondition probably for
Yeah.
being able to navigate it, not being a very online person who just lives for the engagement and the satisfying rage of moral outrage that you feel.
You're really speaking to the comment section of my Instagram page right now. I tell them this all the time. And that's why I'll say incendiary stuff, because I'm like, you don't have to be upset right now. So this seems like a perfect time to talk about your counter speech trainings as we kind of exit out of here. Tell me what you're doing with that, and people can sign up, right? Anybody can sign up with
Well,
you?
it's not released yet, but yeah. So we've done these counter speech trainings. We work with Dangerous Speech Project, which is run by Suzanne Benish. And the idea, of course, of counter speech is that one remedy against hate speech is to try and counter it. And interestingly, very often it's not necessarily that you try to convince the peddler of hate speech that they're wrong, but it's more of sending a message to the audience that someone is actually speaking out against these kinds of ideas, which can be reassuring to minorities who are affected, and just also send a message to listeners, to the audience, that this is not morally acceptable, that there are actually people out there who don't agree and who find those kinds of views abhorrent. And so it's basically an attempt to use the good sides of free speech to fight the dark sides of free
Yeah.
speech, a non-restrictive approach that also empowers and gives agency to people and those affected by
Yeah.
the dark sides. But we're also working on this AI-powered version of it that we're developing with the Data Science Institute here at Vanderbilt. We've run a couple of beta versions. And of course, the idea is at some point to release it, whether it'll be a general release or to specific civil society groups, I don't know. Obviously, first of all, you need to train it to come up with persuasive rather than bland
Mhm.
answers. And you want it to be platform specific.
I think that's great. And I think being exemplary of what it looks like is, at least it's my goal on social media. I'm really looking forward to the analysis from these kinds of studies where we look at like, where was free speech really being honored and where was counter speech done right? And I think that's going to be really exciting to look for. I really enjoyed our conversation now and in the past, and I'm looking forward to your more of your symposiums. And obviously, I think your book is fantastic. And thanks for hanging out.
Thank you so much, Natasha. I really loved it. And delighted that we're living in the same city.
We're neighbors. Yeah, I'm going to come knock on your door.
Please do.
Thanks for hanging out. Here's the big nerve question. How can we reclaim the principles of free speech in a world increasingly dominated by corporate interests? Head on over to bignerve.com to play.